All right, before we begin our lesson today, there are a few things that we need to know that are going to happen within the lesson that I kind of want to highlight before we go into the main part of our new concept today. And so one is called the zero product property. And then the other thing that I want us to talk about is how to sketch the graph of a quadratic function, and how that word sketch is much different than if we were actually graphing the graph of a quadratic. So we want to look at those two items over here and over here before we get into our lesson today. Okay, so the first thing is the zero product property. And all I want you to think about is if I tell you that you're going to take 2 and you are going to multiply it by some number, but that number has to give you a product, a result of 0. So I'm telling you to think about the number 2, and what would you have to multiply it by? What could you multiply it by so that the product, the result, is 0? And we should be thinking that that would have to be 0. Now, that is all that the zero product property tells us. That if we have anything, and if we don't know the value of what anything is, we can call that x. And if we multiply it by something and the result is 0, then that something had to be 0. And so that's what we're going to use today, an extension of that. We're going to say that if I multiply together x times y, and when I multiply x times y, and that equals 0, what does that tell me? Well, it actually tells me two things. It could tell me that x could be 0, because if we took 0 times any number y, we'd have 0. But also that y could be 0, because if we took any number x times 0, our result, our product, would have to equal 0. And so that's all we need to know about the zero product property as we go into this. You probably already knew this, but I just want to make sure that you are reminded of that. If we multiply two things together and the result is equal to 0, the product is 0, then what we know is either the x value is 0 and or the y value is 0. The next thing we want to talk about is sketching a graph. And if we're asked to sketch a graph, we are looking for just the very basic parts of it. So let's say if we had our coordinate plane, the major components that we would be looking for if we're sketching a graph are the following. We would look for the correct shape, meaning is it open up or is it open down? Okay, and remember that we could tell that by the a value. If that a is a positive number, then we know that it's going to open up. If that a is a negative number, then we know it's going to open down. So that's one thing that we're looking for, and we kind of discussed that in last week's lesson about the shape. The other thing that we are going to be looking for, we discussed the vocabulary of it, which is the x-intercepts. And remember, we said that you could also call them solutions, or that we can call them the 0 points, or we call it the roots of the equation. Now, last week we identified where those were, and we defined what those words meant. This week we're going to actually algebraically find where those x-intercepts are, okay? But those are the three things that you need to, or the two things you need to look for as you go into sketching this. So let's say that you found out that the x-intercepts were at 3, 0, and -2, 0. You would just say 1, 2, 3, and then -2. And then you would look at your a value, and let's pretend that your a value was negative. If your a value is negative, then you would simply just sketch that parabola with the correct shape and the correct intercepts. At this point, that's all that we're doing, is just a sketch of the graph.